A big question people usually have is, how does seed funding work? What do I need to know? Charles is going to give you all the insight in the crash course. So please, round of applause for Charles. Let's welcome him to the stage.
Thank you. I think I've got a mic too. Yeah, thanks. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Charles. Nice to meet you all. We'll get everybody settled. So I'm here to talk to you a little bit about just seed funding 101. My goal is to give you some of my thoughts on what works well in the seed funding landscape, which is really dynamic and changing, and hopefully leave plenty of time for questions that any of you might have about your specific situations or general questions. I figured I would just start with a little bit about me. I'm originally from Detroit, Michigan. I've been living in the Bay Area for about 20 years. So I moved out here for school. And about half of my career, I've been a professional venture capitalist, investing other people's money in early stage startups. So I started my career working for In-Q-Tel, the CIA's venture capital group. I was there for about 4 years, helping them invest in hardware and software companies. After that, I worked for a firm called Uncork, which used to be known as Softech, which is about 15 minutes from here. We invested in companies like Fitbit, SendGrid, Poshmark, a number of really interesting companies in the port, including Curse, which is now a part of Amazon, which is cool. And then about 3 years ago, I left Softech Uncork to start my own fund, Precursor. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of the why of Precursor. But prior to that, I also had some operating experience. I worked for Google in a group called New Business Development that helped them staff up the BD function for a bunch of new industries. I spent 5 years working in games, so I started a games company that I would say was not terribly successful, if I'm really honest with myself. Worked for a company that was acquired by Zynga, and worked for another company that's still chugging along. And yeah, so I thought, I've been working as a seed investor for about half of my career, and I thought it was interesting just to give you the quick backstory on Precursor. So we're a 2-person venture fund that's about 10 blocks from here in Union Square in San Francisco. And I tell everyone our strategy is to invest pre-everything. And we'll talk a little bit about why in today's market this strategy of going before data, before product, before traction is something that's, to me, both personally interesting and I think much needed. And so my associate Sydney and I will invest in 15 to 20 companies a year. We'll write a check of anywhere from 100 to 250K into rounds that are $1 million or less. So if you think about what we're doing, we're really finding the person that has that idea or has a rough prototype, but really needs that first bit of money in order to bring that product to market. We don't take board seats, but we try very hard to be helpful and useful to the founders that we back. And we've invested in companies in 13 different states, plus Canada. And we've invested in everything from vertical takeoff and landing aircraft to consumer video messaging apps. So we have a very wide aperture in terms of what we'll do. So I think it's really interesting to talk about the evolution of seed investing, because I think what a seed round is today is very different from what a seed round was 15 years ago when I got into venture. So when I think about the really old days of seed funding, like really old before 2000, the seed market used to be really different. Series A firms did seed rounds. They would give you $2 million and take half of your company. And you would get started from scratch with an idea. And you'd take massive dilution, but you'd get a really dedicated, engaged partner to help you build the business. And for a long time, that was the way you did it. You had to know a venture capitalist, and you had to have connection to him or her. Or the other thing was you had to bootstrap. You had to build your business on the back of customer revenue, personal savings, your own resources. And I think that worked fine for a certain type of entrepreneur for a certain period of time. But around 2004, there's this explosion of what we now call micro VCs. And to me, a micro VC is a VC firm where the size of their fund is $100 million or less. That's really focused on early stage investing. And the reason why micro VCs came to exist is that not everybody could get that 50% dilutive round from a big Series A firm. Those firms emerged because they saw this gap in the market where there were people who needed $1 million or less and really needed help getting over the hump. And so this is the emergence of firms like Softech and Freestyle and Floodgate and Felicis and First Round Capital. This is sort of that generation of firms, and they really filled this important gap, which is not everyone had enough personal savings or network to either meet a venture capitalist or bootstrap their way to a product. And these firms filled this really important gap, and they were doing this really important work of helping people go from idea stage to launch product. But venture is a funny business. It doesn't scale very well. The kinds of investments you can make when you have a small fund that's $15 or $20 million are very different than the kinds of investments you can make when you have a fund that's $100 million. And if you think about the difference, when you have a $15 million fund and you're trying to return money to your investors, almost any outcome is good. If you have a company that sells for $50 million, you can do really well. If you have a $100 million fund, you need really, really big outcomes. And just to give you a sense of quick venture math for those of you who aren't familiar, typically, whatever you raise from your investors, the minimum they want to see back is 3x. So if you raise a $100 million fund, your investors want you to give them $400 million back. So their original investment plus 3 times. So let's just do a quick math exercise. So in order to get $400 million back, what do you need to have happen in terms of outcomes? If you own 25% of every company that you invest in at the time that they're sold, you need $1.6 billion in outcomes to give 400 back to your investors. So if you owned 25% of YouTube when it was sold, you would have been able to return all of that money back to your investors. If you have a $15 million fund, you have to turn that into $60 million. And if you own 10% at the time that you exit, you only need $600 million in outcomes. So the bigger your fund size gets, the bigger the opportunities that you go after have to feel, and the more you need each company to return. And so what happened is these seed funds that started off really focused on helping people get started have morphed into funds that are much larger and have a much higher expectation in terms of what they want to see in terms of traction and progress. Has anyone in here raised seed capital in the last year, just out of curiosity? Okay, we've got a couple brave souls here, good. Hopefully this will match your experience. And it used to be that a seed round was really the first round you raised. It was the round you raised before you had traction and evidence. But now, that's not the case for most entrepreneurs anymore. So now we have this thing called pre-seed. And all pre-seed is, I think, I run a pre-seed firm. I think it's actually kind of a silly term. Pre-seed is just the new seed. The seed round has gone from this $1 million round to this round that's now $2 to $3 million. So now we have a round before the seed round. So you have to call it something, so we call it pre-seed. And the idea is that in the same way that seed funds originally gave you that first $1 million to get started, pre-seed firms like mine can help you get started with that $1 million or less that helps you go from rough idea to launched product. So I just want to talk a little bit about what we've observed in our portfolio. We've invested in about 100 companies at this point. About 2/3 of them were really cold start companies where it was really a founder and an idea, a lot of passion, a lot of drive, a lot of hunger, but not much in the way of progress. And 1/3 of them were repeat founders who had some progress, reputation, sort of knew what they were doing already. So people always ask me, what does it take to raise a seed round? And my answer is, it kind of depends. And this slide's a little busy, but I really think there's 2 really distinct markets for seed financing today. There's the market for what I call the repeat or the famous founder. This is someone who's got big reputation, well-known person, has had a successful exit before. Their process is really different. They basically get the benefit of the doubt. So they're able to raise more money, so anywhere from $2 to $5 million. They're able to raise it on a higher valuation. $8 to $10 million valuations are common. There's very little in terms of requirement that they have a prototype product or sometimes even a clearly defined version of what it is that they want to build. People are really backing up the truck for these folks because they've done it before. And investors invest with the expectation that that founder is going to figure it out. That's a very small sliver of people that raise seed rounds. For the majority of people, the process is really different. If you're a first-time or lower signal founder, and lower signal doesn't mean less capable, it just means you might not be on VC's radar. You're not a famous executive at Dropbox, Twitter, or Square, or Pinterest. The burden of proof will be on you. You're less likely to get the benefit of the doubt to the same degree as that repeat or high signal founder. So what we see is that people who are first-time founders or lower signal, they're raising less money to begin with, $250 to $1 million to get started. They're raising it on lower valuations, so whereas those repeat people are getting kind of 8 to 10s, the founders that we typically work with are raising more at sort of the 2 to 4 or maybe $5 million valuation. So more dilution, lower valuation. And I think for most of these companies, The real question is, can you get enough done with that $1 million or less to unlock the seed round? And so for many of the companies that we work with, the next step in their capital raising journey is to raise a $2 to $3 million seed round. So in essence, if you're a lower signal founder, there is a round before your seed round that you're going to raise. Now I'll admit, some of this is just nomenclature. It's all just money, but it's important, I think, to understand the way people talk about this. And so I thought I would just walk you all through the kind of process that we run with all the companies in our portfolio who want to raise seed capital. So everyone says, we think of it as a 3 or 4 step, but there's a really important step, which I call step 0, which is, are you actually ready to go raise a seed round? And I would say half the time I talk to people who want to raise money, there are glaring things that they haven't gotten right or done that I think they should fix before they go to raise seed capital. So I think the number one thing before you go fundraise is make sure your company's house is in order. Make sure that you've fixed your cap table, that all the option grants you've made have been approved by the board and issued. Make sure you have everything countersigned. Make sure you put founder vesting in place. Make sure that if you have people who are not part of the team, who were once part of the team, that you've resolved all those issues. Because you really want to have the cleanest company possible when you go out to raise capital. The more things that an investor discovers early on that he or she has to clean up, the more work it is to invest. And frankly, the less likely an investor is to say yes to you. And that's something that's under your control. And if you have good legal representation, you should have no issues there. The other piece is, do you have a really credible plan for what you're going to actually do with the money? I would say in most of the companies that we back, 70% of the money they raise goes to salaries, particularly in the Bay Area. Team is usually the one thing you're lacking, and people are expensive. But I think it's really important to build out a financial plan and a narrative. So one part of it is build the plan that says that, hey, if we raise $1 million in a year, our company is going to look like this. We're going to have 50,000 users. We're going to have $10,000 in revenue. Build a really simple plan that you can share with investors, but also build a narrative. Because I think right now there's a lot of talk around what metrics do I need in terms of users, usage, and revenue to unlock a round. In addition to the narrative, you also need to have you need to have a narrative that makes your company sound interesting. So just to give you some perspective, in a normal year, we'll make 15 to 20 investments, but I'll meet 15 to 1,800 companies over the course of a year. So roughly 1% of the companies that we end up investing in, 1% of the companies we meet end up as investments in our portfolio. But there's probably 3 or 4% of the companies that we meet that are good enough to get venture capital. They should get funded. They won't get money from us. They'll hopefully get money from someone else. And when I think about what separates the good ones from the ones that we end up funding, it's really the founder's ability to tell me a compelling narrative about why their company matters. And that's as much about impact and scale and sort of what the world looks like when your company is successful as it is about just the metrics and numbers. So I think it's important to have realistic expectations about what it really takes to raise a seed round today. And this might vary if you're not in the Bay Area or New York or a place where there's sort of capital density. But we have companies in 13 states. And I went back and looked at all the data for the last 10 companies that have raised seed rounds in our portfolio. And this is largely true based on our experience. Most people in our portfolio say, I need to raise a seed round. I think I want to be done in a month. And I tell them you should really plan for 3 to 6 months, which can be a really daunting amount of time. But I think the reason it takes so long is there's some randomness between which VCs you reach out to, who likes your model, whether your calendars align, whether that person is invested in a competitive company, and just the time required to go from meeting someone to getting comfortable to saying yes, to getting all the documentation done, to closing and wiring. I really hope for everyone that it doesn't take 3 to 6 months, but I think if you go into the process expecting that, you won't get discouraged or defeated 3 months in if it takes you longer than you thought. The other thing I'll say is within our portfolio, on average, it takes 40 to 50 introductions over the life of a seed fundraise, which sounds like a lot. And I write a good chunk of these introductions on behalf of our portfolio companies. And part of it is that every investor has his or her own bespoke set of interests. And part of it is finding the right set of people who have capacity to invest an interest in your company and who want to work with you. And with 40 or 50, I typically find that's a big enough sample to figure out if the company is financeable. With that number of intros, we're going to get enough data from the market about what the issues or challenges or perception of the company is. And when it comes to dilution, people say, well, what am I going to give up when I raise this $2 to $3 million seed round? I would say the best companies in our portfolio are able to get away with 10% dilution. So they're able to get the money they need and only sell 10% of the company. That's pretty rare. I'd say on average, the companies in our portfolio end up selling about 20% of the company to get the $2 to $3 million that they raise, sometimes a little bit more, sometimes a little bit less. And in terms of structure, at the pre-seed round where we typically get involved at Precursor, a third of the investments we make are done using safes, the document that Y Combinator has really popularized. A third of them are done with a version of a convertible note that we've developed internally that has some rights and provisions that we care about. And a third of our pre-seed rounds are done as price rounds. Almost all of the seed financings that we do in the portfolio that are $2 to $3 million in size, they're almost all priced rounds with a set valuation, with an option pool, and with a bunch of other rights that really matter to investors that you should definitely educate yourself on if you're an entrepreneur. I would say it's very, very rare that we'll see a seed round of $2 to $3 million done on anything other than a priced round. Sometimes, if it's a company coming from an accelerator or it's an entrepreneur that has tons of leverage, you will occasionally find rounds done on different docs and terms. I'd also just say about 2/3 of the time when a company raises an institutional seed round in our portfolio, they're going to get a board member. Usually only one, but one of the investors involved is going to take a board seat. So the first thing we really advise companies to do when it's time to fundraise is to build a plan and a deck. And I find that most founders that I invest and advise want to jump right to the deck. Working on the deck and the visuals and the story is a lot more fun than working on the plan. But I actually think you have to do both of those things, because the plan you build should inform the amount of money that you want to raise. And the plan is important because I think the goal of a seed round is, remember, your competition when you're fundraising, it's not actually the people on your competition slide. It's all of the other companies that are out there that are raising seed financing that are competing for that investor's attention. That's your real competition. So your job as a founder is to make sure that your company is the top 5 or 10 most interesting things that comes across that person's desk. And that's a combination of building a financial plan that yields a really interesting company. And people say, what's interesting? I would say if you're a B2B company and you're selling to enterprise, you're selling to other businesses, good growth of 10 to 20% and very low churn, those are the kind of things that get people excited. If you're a consumer company, low customer acquisition costs, high usage, fast growth, these are things that get people excited. But you should understand your plan, because you might look at the plan and say, if we raise $2 to $3 million, this company doesn't get to a threshold of being interesting. And what are those thresholds? We'll talk about those in a little bit. But I think if you build the plan first, you understand where you're trying to go. And then you can wrap a narrative with a deck around that. I would also say it's worth the money to pay a professional designer to work on your deck if you can afford it. There are good professional designers that can turn a deck around for under $2,000. And I can tell you, as someone who looks at thousands of decks a year, the difference between a deck with professional visuals and some care put into the design, choice of font, icons, layout, it does make a difference. And so if you can afford it, I think it's a good investment to make on behalf of your company once you've gotten the deck to a point where you're happy with it. One other thing I will say is many venture firms have been pretty upfront with you about the way that they want to be pitched. Down to, so for example, Sequoia has published a document that says, this is the slides that we like to see in this order. They're telling you what they're looking for. And so there are some really good resources out there. DocSend has published some really useful articles around what slides should absolutely be in your pitch deck and the order in which most investors like to see them, and also how much time they spend on each slide. So I would say make sure you understand pitching and presentation conventions when you're putting your deck together, and definitely do it in Keynote, PowerPoint, or PDF. Do it in one of those three formats to make it easy for your investors. I would say the other thing is the hardest part about raising a seed round is finding a lead investor. In most cases, you're going to need a lead investor. Your lead investor is going to be the person who's going to put down financial terms for the round and ideally help you find the rest of the money that you need. And that's the person with whom you're going to principally negotiate the terms of the round. And the reason I think that the lead investor is so important is once you have a lead investor, it's really probably 10 times easier for you as a founder to round up the rest of the capital. And we'll talk about some of the things that VCs tell you when you're looking for a lead investor that will help you smoke out whether people are serious. But a good lead investor should be able to help you accelerate your fundraising process by introducing you to more capital and helping you set terms. I think once you get a lead investor, it's really important to focus on filling out the rest of your round. It's interesting, one of the things I hear from founders all the time when we're helping them fundraise, they'll come back from me and they'll say, I met this VC, they were super pumped about what I'm pitching. They told me as soon as I find a lead investor, I should come back to them and they would totally participate. And they'll say, we've got 5 people who will all participate when we have a lead. I said, then you have nothing. In many cases, that is VC speak for, this is a nice company, I'd like to reserve the right to take another look in the future, but I don't have this sort of drive or conviction to invest now, so come back later when you have a lead. But once you have your lead and you're thinking about filling out your round, I think it's really important to ask yourself, like, what do you want from your investor? Investors are going to pitch you on their value add. I'm available, I've got all these connections, I can help you with all these problems. But to be honest, it takes work on your part as a founder to extract value from value-add investors. You have to spend time with them. And time you spend with your investors is time that will pull you away from building your product or your company. So it's okay to have a mix of really engaged value-add investors and some people who are going to kind of trust you to build the company and will be maybe a little bit more low-key. Some people want everyone to be engaged. Other investors want everyone to be passive. I don't think there's any right or wrong answer, but I think you should be intentional about the kinds of investors you bring into your company and what you ask them for. Because you can't easily get rid of your investors once you add them to the company. You can replace people on your team, you can part ways with your co-founder. Getting rid of your investors once they're on your cap table is very, very difficult. And I'd say the last thing is, it's up to you to close the round. This is probably one of the biggest mistakes I see founders make at the seed stage. They get their lead investor, they get a commitment, and they think that somehow that lead investor is going to drive the closing process around. It is your round, it is your company. You've got to drive the round to close. You've got to set a date by which you want docs in, and you've got to make sure that it happens. Think of it like any sales process. Software products generally don't sell themselves. You need to help the customer through that journey. Closing a venture round is the same way, and I think one of the big questions that we try to help companies think through is, if you can get everybody to sign, wire, and close on the same date, that is the ideal scenario for you as a founder. You'll have one date, all the docs come in, all the wires hit, and you're done. Sometimes it doesn't work that way. Sometimes you'll have $1 million ready to go out of a $2 million round, and you'll ask yourself, do I want to close this $1 million now, get it in the bank, get these people on board, or do I want to have these signed docs hanging out while I try to go close the rest of the money? My personal preference is when you have people that are ready to give you money, you should take it. You never know what could happen in the world, in their personal circumstances, in their attention, that 2 weeks from now, the person who is super fired up to invest in your company could be distracted and on to the next thing. So my encouragement to companies is there's nothing wrong with having multiple closes in a round. If you need 2 closes to get everybody in, by all means do it. And I think it's worth thinking about VC speak. I think VCs say a lot of things that founders misinterpret. Some of them I think are honest miscommunication. I think some of them are designed to make you feel good. And so these are all things that I hear people tell the companies that we've invested in, and founders like, what does this mean? Just to be clear, almost all of these things mean no. Some of them mean like never going to invest in your company under any circumstances. Some of them mean the timing's not right, you can come back to me. And some of you probably heard this. We're definitely interested, come back to us when you have a lead investor. That means not now and probably never, but please come back to me if you find a great investor who'll lead the round. We'd love to get another look when you have more traction. Who wouldn't love to see more data? Oftentimes, my experience has been the people who want to see more data always want to see more data. And if they tell you, hey, come back to me when you have 100,000 users, you'll come back with 100,000 users, and they'll have some new reason why they're not ready to invest. One of my favorites is I couldn't get my partnership over the hump on this one, which I feel like is cheap deflection. It's like your job is to sell internally. If there's a legitimate reason that your partnership didn't approve the deal, don't hide behind your partners. Be honest about why you wouldn't invest. And my personal favorite, this feels really early, but we'd love to stay in touch. I'm sure you've all heard this. One of the nice things about being a pre-seed investor is we're not allowed to say that. There is no such thing as too early for a precursor. Companies I back get this all the time, and founders are like, oh, he was so close and he wants to stay in touch. I'm like, that person's probably never going to invest in your company. I'll just be honest with you. And so part of my job as an investor is to sort of do the back channel for our companies and say, hey, why did you guys really decide not to invest? And weirdly, sometimes investors are more comfortable telling other investors the real reason why they passed than they are telling the founders themselves. So be on the lookout for anything that doesn't sound like an unabashed yes. Normally, if you push on it hard enough, you'll find that it's a well-packaged no. So the other thing that's, I think this terrifies a lot of the companies that we back at Precursor, the day that you close your seed round, the clock for Series A starts. And so typically what happens for people is it's so hard to raise your seed round. You finish it and you're happy and you're like, oh, we got this done. Now we can catch our breaths, and you should totally celebrate for a day. Be very happy that you have the money, high five, do a company party of some sort, and then you got to get back to work, because remember, your seed round investors invested in your company because they think that there's a path to Series A. They think that they're getting on the early phase of a journey for a company that's going to become very important and impactful in the future. So the first meeting you're going to have with them, oftentimes after you close the seed round, is, all right, let's talk about Series A metrics and how we're going to get there. And so people always ask me, what are the metrics I need to hit to raise a Series A? And VCs will tell you, okay, if you're an enterprise software company, we'd like to see you get to an annualized revenue run rate of $2.5 million for your B2B software company. So founders diligently run really hard and try to build the business. I don't actually think most Series A investors know what they want to see until they see it. But if you think about it from their point of view, I'm a pre-seed investor. I can make 15 or 20 investments a year. A Series A investor is going to make, 2 or 3 investments per partner per year. It's a different filter. That person gets 2 shots, maybe 3 shots a year to say yes to a company. So think about that. It's 4 to 5. They have 4 to 5 times fewer chances to say yes. So to stand out, you have to stand out. And I think when Series A VCs give you metrics around revenue or user usage, they're just trying to shape their own meeting funnel. They're trying to say, look, I only want to meet with companies that are in the top 10, 15% of performance. So if at one point in time, there was one point in time where $1 million in revenue was the threshold for Series A. But over time, more companies were able to get to $1 million in revenue, so it was no longer a useful filter for the person who's trying to find the top of the top companies in terms of performance. And even if you hit $2.5 million, this magic $2.5 million in annual recurring revenue, it's not an automatic, sufficient unlock. It's not like if you get there, someone's going to give you money. You'll get meetings, but I think most Series A investors, it's really important, I think, for founders to think about this. The later you go in your fundraise, investors start thinking, can this company return my fund? Can my investment in this company and the ownership that I own, based on what I think the outcome can be, is it going to be meaningful to my fund? So if you think of a big $1 billion fund, a fund that's raised $1 billion, a meaningful exit for them is $250, $500 million. But it's not life-changing for that fund. It'll be life-changing for you as a founder, most likely. But if they only own 20 or 25% of your company, you sell for 500, you high five, and they go, well, we got 125 back. We still have 875 we have to find from within the portfolio in order to return our fund. And so the expectations for sort of what a big company feels like to a big fund is very different from what it feels like for a small fund like mine. And I think as you go through your fundraise, if you always try to think about the person on the other side of the table as an investor and what he or she needs to see in order for it to be a success, I think you'll have a good experience. So that's all I had for you. I wanted to leave plenty of times either for questions from the Twitch stream or for the audience, but I thought I would just try to give you all kind of a distilled version of the advice that I give our portfolio companies when they go out for seed financing, and I hope those of you in the room find it useful. I think I've got a question in the back.
So what space are you currently investing? You mentioned a wide gamut, but then are you interested in data analytics and AI?
I mean, the question is what space we're invested in. I'm a generalist, so I tend to think entrepreneurs are better at picking ideas than I am at picking ideas they should work on. So we look at almost everything. There's a couple of things I don't do. I don't do space and satellites. I don't do anything that requires a deep knowledge of chemistry, biology, or physics. I'm not a scientist, so I sort of leave those things to others. I can tell you, the last 4 investments I've made were a crypto asset fund, an institutional trading platform for cryptocurrency, a kids eyeglasses company, and a company that's using computer vision to prevent phishing on websites. So a lot of times it's I meet a founder who's really so what we're looking for is someone that has a unique insight on the market they're going after. And whenever I find someone who has that unique insight and can tell me a good story, I get really excited. The things I avoid are crowded competitive markets because I think, so data analytics is a market where I meet lots of companies and sometimes they all kind of feel the same to me, all of their messaging feels the same, their go-to-market feels the same, the sort of product value prop feels the same. And I just worry that all of those companies are going to end up duking it out in the market and there'll be no winner. So I try to find companies where it feels like the space is not crowded, which usually means the space isn't well defined. So we try to take markets that feel like they're really nascent as opposed to markets that are maybe well established.
Whoa. This is the voice of Twitch. So, user Husky Potato.
Yep. Nice.
Wants to know, what are the approximate volumes of money for seed and Series A investments? How much should you expect? What should you look for?
At a company level?
How much is that funding round generally for those different stages?
So for us, the pre-seed rounds are generally less than $1 million, and I would say the median is probably $500K, and the average is probably $750. For seed rounds in our portfolio, I would guess that the median is probably 2.5, and the average is probably 3. And then Series A's are all over the map. It's sort of by modal. We have a bunch that are 4 to 6 and a bunch that are 8 to 10, and not much in the 6 to 8 range.
Excellent. Audience question? Perfect.
We've got someone right here.
How much time do you spend with the founders?
Yeah.
With the investment which you made? And then what are the top 3 challenges you see working with them?
So the question is, how much time do we spend with founders after we invest, and what are the top 3 challenges? So my goal is this might be a little touchy-feely, but my view is it's my job to convince a founder that spending time with me is valuable and helpful to him or her. And so our basic offer is we can meet with you once a month and in a structured way where we'll talk about what's happening with the business and what challenges you face. For really early stage companies, so I have some companies where it's solo founder, first time person. I see those companies every 2 weeks. Mostly because I think it's really hard and lonely to be a solo founder, particularly if you're doing it for the first time. I try to be more available for them. I tell them that they can text or call anytime. So every day I keep about 2 hours of my day open for random stuff that comes up. So it's 2 30-minute blocks and 4 15-minute blocks. So if something comes up that's day of, you need my feedback, I generally can accommodate that. So the number one thing I do for people is actually what we call on-demand support. It's this thing happened and I really want feedback. So an example of that is I met someone who hired someone from a big company into a small company. In a weekend, the founder's I feel like this isn't working. I feel like this person doesn't actually understand what it means to be in a company of my size. And I just need to talk to someone to understand whether the signals I'm seeing should be alarming to me. And the answer was yes. But that was something that was stressing that founder out that he needed to get off his chest. The second thing I spend time on is I help people close candidates. And a lot of the founders I meet, I tell them, you've got to get good at sourcing candidates. You're going to be hiring people for your startup for your whole career. But I can give you third-party perspective on whether this person is good, or my assessment of what their strengths and weaknesses are. So I probably do 10 of those calls a week. And the thing I spend the most time on is helping other people fundraise. So we oftentimes write the first check into a company. I say, now that I've invested, I'm going to help you raise the rest of the money that you need. And the biggest challenges that founders have that I find are usually around getting stuck in product market fit. They have some little glimmer of users and usage, and they're not sure if it's indicative of a big idea. The other thing is, when you're a founder, you spend all of your time really focused on your company, your company's problems, and I don't. But I know you, and a lot of times people come to me like, I'm stuck, and they just tell me what they're stuck on. I go, oh, as someone who knows you and knows the business, let me give you like an outsider's perspective on the problem you just presented with me. And a lot of it's just trying to help people get unstuck so they can keep going. Those are the main areas.
The next question from Twitch.
Yeah.
Prepare yourself for the username. So you have Wang Mang.
These are great usernames.
It's a two-part question, actually.
Okay.
So I'm also going to throw Light Skin Zeno's question in there also.
Okay.
First one is, do you see VCs nowadays using ML to accelerate decision-making for what startups will succeed? And the second question is around ML. Do you think that investors are jumping on bandwagons of investing in companies just because they're using AI? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Totally. Wow. Those are two really great questions. So I'll take the first one, which is, are investors using ML to expedite decision making? The answer is there are some firms that are. I know some firms that have built, I think if you look at what Social Capital is doing with capital as a service, that's basically a big data exercise where they're taking a ton of data about a bunch of startups and trying to figure out kind of what correlates well with success. It's harder to do at pre-seed because there isn't very much data other than data about the founders. Like where did they go to school? Where did they work before? What other indicators that they have. I would say most firms I know are using data science or ML more on the sourcing end to figure out what companies they should look for and where they should spend their time, more than for diligence. But there are definitely firms that are using it. And the question is, do VCs jump on bandwagons around hot buzzwords? Absolutely. And do founders sometimes try to manipulate VCs by jumping on a bandwagon? Absolutely. Like the number of times I saw companies 6 months ago that were ML companies that are now AI companies. They're the same founders and the same product, just different domain, like literally like different web domain, but like everything else the same. I don't blame them. If I were reading an article that said VCs are really into AI, and I had something that felt like AI, I'd probably brand it as an AI company too. I don't blame people. I think the smart people though understand, is this a company that's fundamentally enabled by AI or ML, or are they just using this buzzword as a way to get a meeting?
Audience question?
Yeah.
Oh, we got one in the back.
Hi, so my question is, after a seed money has been invested, so what is the typical financial arrangement between the startup and the investor or the VC? So in terms of, how does the VC get their money back, or do they become a part owner, or what?
Yeah, the question is, how does the VC get the money back? I won't get into the boring parts about finance and tax code, but basically as an investor, I can make money two ways. I can make money if a company is acquired or if a company goes public. You having a really profitable company that issues a stream of dividends is actually not desirable for me for a bunch of tax reasons that I won't go into. So I need companies to either get acquired or go public. So a really successful company that doesn't go public is interesting to me, or doesn't get acquired is interesting to me, but doesn't help me meet my returns goals. So one thing you should know is that if you take money from VCs, that's the outcome that's meaningful to us as investors, is some will eventually acquire the business or it'll go public. There are rare cases where a company becomes wildly profitable, has no interest in going public or selling, and they buy out their shareholders at some premium. Or you sell the company to a private equity firm that's willing to hold it for some period of time. But in 99% of cases, as an investor, your expectation is this company will one day either get acquired by someone else or go public, and that's when you'll get your liquidity.
I'm going to do one more question from Twitch. I'm going to let you choose. Do you want a secondary question from Wang Mang, or do you want to go with OMG Fiends?
Let's go with OMG fees. We'll spread it around.
All right, OMG Fiends wants to know, what are some tips on getting investors on your side? What to look for, or what do they basically look for when you're presenting to them? Like, what should they be doing?
So one I think useful tip when you're meeting with investors is you have to understand like an investor workflow. Typically, if you're going to a fund that has multiple partners, you're probably going to meet one person in that first meeting. And let's say you meet that person on a Tuesday. Most venture funds do their big team powwow meeting on Monday, and they talk about everything that they've seen and what they're excited about. So if you pitch someone at a 4-person fund on Tuesday, they're going to see a lot of companies between now and their next partner meeting. And you want to have what your company does be super easy to remember. So let me tell you what happens in a partner meeting when it's super easy to remember. What's your name, sir? Arnie. I go to a partner meeting. I met Arnie's company. Arnie's company is amazing. It's Airbnb for hamsters. And people are like, okay, like I understand what that means, and like, let me tell you what else can happen. I met Arnie's company. What do they do? You know, it's kind of this like thing, and it's like hamsters and sharing. You got to meet Arnie. Now, which of those do you think in a group setting is a more compelling message to your partnership? The simple, clear, crisp articulation of what you do is what gets the firm excited. So when you're thinking about how you remain relevant and top of mind, you want to make sure that the takeaway about what your company does is really easy for that person to remember and repeat to their partners, because they might see 40 or 50 companies between now and the next time they get together with their group. And the better that person understands what you do and why, the better job they can do selling on your behalf internally, and the better the chance of you getting another meeting.
We'll do one more last question from the audience.
Hey, thanks, Charles, for your time. Quick question. What's your experience with and advice to part-time founders, especially at the really early stage? Do you ever interact with them, or do you tell them, don't come to me till you're full-time?
I would say the question is part-time founders, what advice do I have for them? I'm a realist. There are some people who are just not in a position to drop everything and work on a startup full-time. You might have family obligations. You might not be sure enough that you are totally sold in the thing that you're building. There's a lot of reasons why people can't do it. I would say most investors will not invest in a founder who's not working on the product full-time. The closest I've gotten to investing in a full-time founder is I invested in someone who had quit their job at Google on Monday, and I met them on Tuesday. So the person's like, I'm done. Like, I've quit. I'm not going back. And that's an important signal, I think, to most investors, is that I'm going to give you money with a goal that you're going to build a company. I kind of want to feel like you're all in and that you're not hedging with a part-time job. The other thing is that when you're working on a startup part-time, it never goes as fast as it does when you're working on it full-time. And there's things that you learn about the business working on it full-time that I think are transformative. So my view is if you're a part-time founder, for whatever reason, I wouldn't encourage you to fundraise unless you're ready to go full-time. And I think most VCs have an allergic reaction if you say, I would do this full-time if I had the money. Most VCs are just like, ooh, that doesn't feel good. I think it's unfair. Different people have different financial circumstances, but I think that's a turnoff for most people.
Charles, thank you very much.
Thank you
As
so
always, round of applause for Charles.
Thank you.